Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, a 2025 to 2026 Survival Guide to Sustainability and Product Compliance. And as always, just a few tips and an orientation about the webinar platform before I introduce our speakers for today. The webinar slides are available to the left side of your screen, along with a few helpful links if you would like to explore, learn more about compliance and risks and how we can help simplify and accelerate your compliance processes. And we want this webinar to be as engaging as possible, so please do send us any questions you may have, and we'll aim to address them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And if you would like to submit a question for this Q&A session, just use the Ask a Question widget on the left side of your screen. And we'll follow up with you directly for any questions that we don't get to during today's live session. At any time, if you're interested in having a member of our team follow up with you outside of this Ask a Question functionality, don't hesitate to use the Start a Conversation button at the bottom of your screen. And last but not least, the webinar recording will be sent to you within 24 hours. So my name is Orla Morris and I'm the Content Marketing Manager here at Compliance and Risks, and I'm delighted to be joined today by a wonderful team from Cooley, Claire Temple, Emma Bichet, Jessica Coffell and Philip Brown. So just starting with Claire. Claire is a partner in Cooley's Product Compliance and Liability team. She specialises in advising clients on regulatory risk, compliance and litigation issues. Claire helps clients who deal with products and consumers, working with them to help bring both digital and physical products to market, advising on labelling, packaging, regulatory approvals, and engaging with regulators and consumers. She also has significant experience in coordinating and delivering business-critical international regulatory and compliance advice, and delivering complex multi-jurisdictional projects. Claire also advises clients when things go wrong, such as dealing with regulatory and compliance issues, crisis management, handling and coordinating regulatory crises, product recalls, and product compliance matters. She also manages customer relations and claims and investigating and defunding regulatory investigations and prosecutions. Claire is recommended within the product liability category by the latest 2021 edition of the UK Legal 500. Thank you so much for joining us today, Claire.
Thank you so much, Orla, and thank you to you for the invitation and for chairing as well. We're very grateful.
Great. Next, Emma Bichet, Special Counsel from Cooley, who leads Cooley's ESG, Environmental, Social and Governance and Sustainability Advisory practice in Europe. She has extensive experience advising on EU and UK ESG, sustainability and product law matters. Emma has a strong grasp of ESG and products regulation, working with the world's top companies to clarify their obligations in the EU and UK. She advises on the full range of sustainability issues, including reporting obligations under the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, supply chain due diligence, forced labour, deforestation and product-related sustainability requirements such as eco-design, chemical compliance, packaging and recycling obligations. She also supports clients with their marketing and claims. Emma has experience making complaints to the European Commission on behalf of her clients, supporting them in litigation before the EU courts, and regularly manages multi-jurisdictional compliance projects for her clients. She is also very active in horizon spotting, keeping abreast of new EU, UK and global initiatives to assist clients wishing to provide input on the legislative process and adapt their business in time when new rules are developed. Thank you so much for joining us today, Emma.
Oh, thanks so much for having us, Orla.
Next, we're joined by Jessica Coffell, Special Counsel from Cooley, who focuses on European law and the regulation of medicinal products and medical devices, including in vitro diagnostic medical devices. She helps guide life sciences companies through the regulatory processes and technical requirements governing the approval and marketing of their products, from classification and clinical trials and audits to promotion and marketing. Jessica provides strategic advice from the early developmental stages to placing on the market and post-marketing activities. She also assists clients in their interactions with regulatory authorities, notified bodies, and business partners. Thanks for joining us today, Jessica.
Thank you, Orla. Great to be here.
Great. And last but certainly not least, Philip Brown, Special Counsel from Cooley. Philip focuses on global product compliance and litigation and advises innovative companies on product safety and consumer law, helping them navigate recalls, regulatory investigations, enforcement actions, and complex disputes. Drawing on more than 15 years of experience, including more than a decade in federal government compliance and enforcement roles at the US Consumer Product Safety Commission and Federal Trade Commission, Philip offers clients practical strategies and steady judgment in addressing today's most complex regulatory challenges. It's great to have you today, Philip.
Thrilled to be here.
Brilliant. And now, before we kick off the webinar, I just want to provide a bit of background about compliance and risks for those who are joining this series for the first time. At Compliance and Risks, our mission is to help ensure global companies have the tools and information to build safe, sustainable products in a world full of change. We are the trusted product compliance technology provider for some of the world's leading brands and have spent 2 decades honing the digital tools, expertise, and content you need to stay ahead of the dynamic regulatory landscape, proving your product's compliance, protecting your brands, and importantly, helping to drive your growth. And the proof is in the numbers here. We have the world's most comprehensive regulatory database with over 100,000 regulations historically available in C2P. And with a global regulatory coverage and expertise across over 10 industries, we definitely understand that regulatory compliance doesn't sleep. And our regulatory expert team is truly global, with 28 languages collectively spoken across the team, all fortified by our 30 knowledge partners. And C2P is our enterprise software designed to keep global organizations on top of regulatory changes and their impact worldwide. And this includes features such as early warning alerts, impact probability, productivity workflow tools, and so much more. And with that, I'm delighted to finally hand it over to you, Claire.
Thank you so much, Orla. So in terms of what we wanted to cover today, we have quite a packed agenda, so I will try and keep this very short, but we wanted to touch upon EU sustainability and some of the key developments there. The next thing that we wanted to talk about is some of the general product safety framework developments that we've seen, specifically in the EU with the General Product Safety Regulation, and also in the UK with the Product Regulation and Metrology Act. We'll next move on to looking at a couple of themes that we're seeing coming out of the US, which is around deregulation and fragmentation, which is a really interesting comparison to what we're seeing in the EU. And then we'll go back to the EU and we'll look at some pharma and device regulations updates as well. Finally, to the extent that we have time, we'd be really happy to answer your questions as well. So do feel free to put those on the Q&A coming through. On that then, I will hand over to Emma.
Thanks so much, Claire. So I'm going to be talking about taking stock of the changes in the world of sustainability regulations. I don't know if anyone's been following this, but if you have, you'll know that there's just been a lot of action here recently. And what we found with our clients is that it has been really quite difficult for them just to keep on top of everything. So what I wanted to do today is just give a short recap or kind of bird's eye view of where things stand right now, and also talk about what hasn't changed and what is still on course to apply next year, because I think sometimes with the focus on all the simplifications and all the changes going on, we can lose sight of what's kind of staying in place and what we still need to be working towards. Then at the end of my section, I'm going to briefly look at the global sustainability landscape. And companies will be glad to hear there's also been a lot of moving pieces there as well. So on this first slide, this is kind of an overview of the simplification of the EU sustainability laws. And just to kind of give an idea of how quickly things are changing, I think we sent these slides 2 days ago, and some of them are already out of date. So the first 2 rows of this slide relate to what we've been calling Omnibus 1, which basically refers to the simplification of the EU's CSRD, which is a law that requires ESG reporting and audit, and also the CSDDD, which is a law that requires human rights and environmental due diligence. On the CSRD, which is our first row here, earlier in the year, the EU adopted what they called the Stop the Clock Directive, and that pushed back the CSRD reporting obligation by 2 years from fiscal 2025 to fiscal 2027 for what we call Wave 2 reporters. Wave 2 are basically the group that impacted most of our clients the most because it's the non-listed EU companies. And that includes EU companies that are subsidiaries of US or other non-EU parents. For most businesses, it won't come as a surprise that this delay was really a welcome reprieve, just because the CSRD does require very fulsome reporting and also the third-party audit obligation. Then on Monday of this week, so 2 days ago, the EU announced that they finally agreed, after months and months of negotiations, they finally agreed on the position on the amendments to both the CSRD and the CSDDD. For CSRD, the main change are the scoping criteria. So the EU has now confirmed that CSRD will apply to EU companies that have at least 1,000 employees and over 450 million euros of turnover. The effect of this is going to be to take quite a few companies that might previously have been in scope of the CSRD out of scope. So what we're advising our clients to do is recheck your scoping and see if this change will impact your business and your compliance obligations. In parallel, the reporting standards for CSRD are still in the process of being simplified. That hasn't been finalised yet. We don't yet have agreement, but we are expecting that one pretty soon. So on CSDDD, this is the one where the slide's unfortunately already out of date. And that's because the scoping thresholds were also changed on Monday. So it's now been confirmed that to be in scope, EU companies will need to generate 1.5 billion euros in turnover and have over 5,000 employees. There is no employee threshold for non-EU groups, but they will need to generate at least 1.5 billion euros in the EU to be in scope of the CSDDD. The actual due diligence obligations that companies will have to deal with have been kept for the most part, although there have been some changes there. There was originally an obligation to adopt a climate transition plan, which has now been deleted. And the application date for the CSDDD has also been pushed back by 1 further year, which means that it's going to start to apply from July of 2029. The EU deforestation regulation is the third row on this slide. There's just been a massive amount of flip-flopping from the EU on this one. We actually had to stop sending our clients alerts on this because it was just getting embarrassing how quickly it was changing and then changing back again. But finally, the good news is that we also have clarity on this one. The EU has agreed to a further 1 year delay to the EU deforestation regulation, which is now going to start to apply from the 30th of December 2026 instead of the 30th of December of this year of 2025. This extra year, again, we're hearing from our clients is really, really welcome to them. It just gives them some extra time to gather the information that they need from their suppliers to comply with this one. The big concern for deforestation regulation compliance was if you don't have the information needed on time, that your products will just end up being stuck in customs. The fourth one on our list there is the EU batteries regulation. So this one is a little bit more under the radar, but it also has a quite significant supply chain diligence chapter, requiring companies to do environmental and human rights due diligence. Again, quite a heavy compliance burden for the companies that are in scope. So these ones, the actual obligations have been maintained, but the compliance deadline was pushed back earlier this year from August 2025 to August 2027. And I should just say the rest of the EU batteries regulation, which are more the device side requirements, the actual obligations for batteries themselves have not been impacted by this delay. So it's only the supply chain diligence chapter. Last but not least, we have the CBAM regulation, which is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. That one's still going to apply from January of 2026. But the change there that's been adopted is that the de minimis threshold has been significantly raised, which means that less companies are going to find themselves in scope of that one. So that was a kind of high-level overview of the main changes that we've seen in the world of sustainability regulation in Europe. With this next slide, I just wanted to flag that obviously there have been a lot of changes, but there are still a massive amount of sustainability regulations that haven't changed. We've gathered a few of the main ones on this slide. And just to give you a few examples, there's the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, which imposes a public disclosure requirement on quantities of unsold consumer products that are discarded each year, along with an explanation of what happens to them. So these disclosures are still going ahead, and for most companies, they're due in 2026, based on data from the 2025 fiscal year. There's a set EU format that needs to be complied with on how you present those disclosures. There's also 3 other big ticket sustainability laws that will start to apply from 2026 onwards. And these are the Right to Repair Directive, the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation, and the EU's Green Transition Directive. The Green Transition Directive in particular is a gift that just keeps on giving. It's going to impact companies' green claims. There's sustainability labels. It also imposes new information requirements on consumer guarantees and warranties. And we're finding a lot of our clients are having to update their websites to comply with this, which again can take kind of a significant amount of time. At the bottom of that table on the slide there are 2 rules that are going to start to apply in 2027, which are the revisions to waste framework rules and also the EU forced labour regulation, which is going to start to apply from 2027, and in practice requires companies to do some human rights due diligence because it effectively bans any products being imported into Europe or exported out of Europe that have forced labour anywhere in the supply chain. So that's Europe. I then wanted to move on internationally. Here we go. The details. So we're seeing internationally kind of similar trends to what we've been going through in Europe. ESG regimes kind of shifting about all over the place. In some jurisdictions, we are seeing delays and simplifications. So a couple of examples of this are Singapore, which announced earlier in the year that it's planning to delay its sustainability reporting regime. There's also been some drama in California, which has pushed back the deadline for greenhouse gas emission reporting. And enforcement of the Californian climate risk reporting rule has also been paused pending appeal in the courts. At the same time, what we're seeing is that there are other jurisdictions that are just kind of pressing ahead. And recently we've seen new laws coming out of Spain and also the UAE that will impact non-listed companies, which means that, you know, if you've got subsidiaries in your org chart based in Spain or based in the UAE, it's worth checking whether you might be in scope of those rules. China also looks set to have mandatory sustainability reporting, including, again, for non-listed Chinese companies. And there's also a variety of proposals that we're watching in Asia, which are really interesting, that would require companies to do human rights and environmental due diligence on their supply chain. So we're kind of moving into 2026 with a bit more clarity on where we stand, particularly in Europe. Still a lot of action upcoming and plenty for companies to be getting on with, just in case you had nothing else to do in 2026. So with that kind of high-level overview, I want to pass back to Claire, who's going to talk us through some of the important developments in the world of product regulation.
Thank you so much, Emma. As I mentioned before, what I wanted to take a couple of moments to talk about was a couple of the general product safety regimes, one in the EU and also one in the UK. We'll start off with the EU, and the purpose of this slide here is to help you try and visualise where it is that the General Product Safety Regulation, which is the EU's General Product Safety Framework, sits in relation to other pieces of law. So on the left-hand side, you can see that we have comprehensive sector regimes when it comes to medicine and food. So that means that there is a lot of legislation which from start to finish, product launch all the way through to product recall, comprehensively deals with products which are medicines and products which are food. When it comes to consumer products, it's a little bit more of a patchwork situation. So first of all, we've got those sector regimes. You'll see, for example, we've put some examples there like Radio Equipment Directive, Electromagnetic Compatibility Directive. Those are particular laws in relation to consumer products which tackle either a particular feature, so that might be Bluetooth, Wi-Fi enablement, or particular categories like toys or safety. You might also know these very well as CE marking laws or NLF, New Legislative Framework Laws. I say new, they actually stem from about 2008, so not so new anymore. Then sitting across the top of all of those is the General Product Safety Regulation. This used to be the General Product Safety Directive, which first came in around 2001. That was replaced last year, in December last year, so it's nearly a year old, with the General Product Safety Regulation. And what that does is it fills in the gaps for all of those specific laws that we see below, but also in relation to products which aren't covered by any of those specific laws, it covers those products entirely. The types of products that you might be thinking about there are furniture, textiles, baby care products. It's quite a wide range of products though. Underpinning all of that, you'll see that we talk about standards as well. Standards are the things that help provide the detail in order to comply with the high-level requirements set out in the law. The new rules under the General Product Safety Regulation started to apply from December 13th. And in terms of the types of changes that they brought about, this really has been seen as quite a significant change in the EU. We've summarised here kind of 10 of what we think are the biggest changes. That doesn't mean this is everything. But the first is, in relation to non-harmonised products, that means non-CE mark products. It aligned the requirements for those with those CE mark products. And the types of requirements we're talking about are having to have a technical file, having to do pre-market risk assessment. So it really started to make the compliance requirements much more significant for non-harmonised products. The second is, bearing in mind that it was replacing a piece of legislation from 2001, it made updates to deal with the risks of new technologies. Very much a theme that we've seen through lots of EU legislation coming in over the last 5 to 10 years, is really trying to keep pace with technology, and GPSR makes no exception for that. The third was that it made updates considering the circular economy, i.e. that it actually calls out the fact that it applies to second-hand and refurbished products. There are some exceptions there, of course. It doesn't apply to antiques. It doesn't apply to second-hand products which are marked as being needed to be refurbished or reconditioned. There are specific requirements for online sales, and we'll talk about those in a bit more detail in a minute. There's also a whole article which is focused on new obligations for online marketplaces. Online marketplaces previously hadn't been specifically called out by product safety legislation, and they are under EU GPSR. A very significant change is that it introduced mandatory accident reporting. Those familiar with the regime in the EU will know that previously we just had risk reporting. So where it was that EU determined that there was an unacceptable risk with a product, you needed to report that. But now there is mandatory accident reporting, provided it meets a certain threshold. There's a big theme here around communication. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail, but around new mechanisms for consumers and other interested parties to be able to report issues. There were specific requirements in relation to recalls. So there's actually now a template notice that you are encouraged to follow when it is that you're putting together recall notification, and also requirements not to use certain words, such as voluntary, when you're talking about recalls. It expands the role of SafetyGate. Now, SafetyGate is the mechanism by which you can notify the European Commission about an unsafe product, and all the member states as well. And also, it very much called for stronger enforcement. A recent development, by the way, is that guidance was issued just a few weeks ago, just to help people navigate GPSR. That guidance is very useful, probably if you're like a small to medium enterprise, and that's who it was targeted at. If you're a larger enterprise and you're more sophisticated, you may not find that guidance particularly enlightening. However, there are some very helpful Q&A documents as well on the European Commission's website, which it's worth looking at. So just going into a little bit more detail, online sales. So this was a particular big change under GPSR, which is under online sales, the specific offer for the product now needed to include additional information, so details of the manufacturer, details of the responsible person in the EU. Now, this is a requirement which has been brought over from the market surveillance regulation. So that used to be that all CE mark products needed to have a responsible person in the EU that was trying to address the perceived risks of particularly Chinese-based manufacturers manufacturing and then sending products over online into the EU, and they didn't necessarily have anybody EU-based. So there's a requirement that you need to have a responsible person in the EU. That requirement is now also in GPSR. So basically for all consumer products, there needs to be a responsible person. You need to be able to identify the product with a picture, and then also you need to ensure that any warnings and safety information, which typically you'd find on the box, on the product and the packaging, are also replicated in the offer. It's quite a big lift, by the way, for marketing departments, I think, trying to incorporate that information into those online sales offers. I mentioned before about this theme of enhanced communication. So under GPSR, there were various different measures around ensuring that consumers and other interested parties were able to raise issues, raise concerns that they had directly with manufacturers, importers, but also directly with online marketplaces, meaning that they needed to identify a single point of contact that consumers could communicate directly and rapidly with, and also ensuring that member state authorities could be contacted directly as well. Also, the European Commission, I mentioned this expanded role of SafetyGate, but they've expanded SafetyGate in such a way that consumers can now report directly to them as well any concerns that they have in relation to products. We thought it was worth touching upon enforcement, given that we are now coming up to nearly a year of GPSR. And GPSR really did very much call for more active enforcement. Certainly, on behalf of our clients, we are seeing more active enforcement by member states. At the moment, I'd say that's more on a collaboration, engagement type level, which is reminding people of the requirements, asking them how it is that they're complying with the new requirements, particularly when it is that they are engaging with recalls. There's a particular requirement when you have a recall to ensure that you are offering 2 out of 3 remedies to consumers. So that might be a replacement, a repair, or a refund. And we've seen particular engagement from member states in relation to that. But we are yet to see anything really significant or major. So at the outset, we wondered if we might start to see enforcement which was much more on a level playing field with maybe GDPR, possibly even DSA. We are yet to see that, but that does not mean that's not coming. And then the final thing to mention in relation to GPSR is software enforcement. So I haven't touched upon this yet, but I really want to flag that GPSR also covers software. It's not explicitly covered in the legislation itself, but just before GPSR came into force, the European Commission mentioned firstly verbally and then in their Q&A documents that they very much considered software to be covered and in scope of GPSR. And that doesn't mean just software which is embedded in hardware, but it also means standalone software. Subsequently, we have seen a lot of discussion around in terms of the type of software that they might be targeting. We might be looking at such things like chatbots, for example. It's a really interesting development. As yet, we haven't seen anything on the enforcement front, but watch this space. That very much could be coming for 2026. And then really briefly, I wanted to touch on the UK side of things. So the position for UK was they were following General Product Safety Directive, but the UK left the EU before General Product Safety Regulation came in. So they were stuck with the old laws. As a result, UK government has decided to overhaul the UK position, and they've come out with the Product Regulation and Metrology Act, which we call PRAM for short. In terms of what PRAM is, so PRAM is now in law. It came into law in July of this year, but it is very much just an enabling act. That means that it is very overarching. It provides a framework. And the real thing that it does is it then allows the government to bring in specific new rules for lots of different areas via secondary legislation. So those will be regulations. That means that they can bring about significant reform in relatively short timeframes without the usual scrutiny that would accompany primary legislation. Secondary legislation has significantly fewer requirements in terms of consultation. There was, by the way, an amendment quite late in the day requiring the government to consult with stakeholders about the secondary legislation because there were concerns about things being passed through too quickly. But it does mean that when that secondary legislation comes about, you should expect it to come into force much, much more quickly than if it were primary legislation. In terms of what we're expecting first, the secondary legislation will cover product requirements. It will probably cover things around information and cost recovery. But in terms of specific areas that we think will be tackled first, we believe it will be online marketplaces. That will be one of the first areas which we expect to see some draft regulations. We had thought they might come out before Christmas, but I expect it might be now just after Christmas. And that is my very quick snapshot of the general product safety frameworks for EU and UK. I will now hand over to Philip.
Thank you, Claire. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to speak with you about this topic of what's going on in the US. Obviously, every time there's a change in administration and a new, change in leadership and direction, whether it's at the federal level or the state level, we can see changes in the regulatory landscape and compliance risks. Early in the year, there was obviously a lot of activity on the federal level with things like DOJ coming in to the federal government and shaking up the very existence of some agencies and also, at others, developing a new focus on enforcement. And kind of countering that or working alongside that in the background, the Trump administration also issued several executive orders that required agencies to look at their existing rules and regulations and examine ways to find streamlining and areas to adjust focus. And so, some examples of that are, for example, the Department of Transportation did away with limits on driver hours and postponed rules for hazardous material transport. That's one area where there's now new regulation coming into play versus what was already in the works. The EPA has weakened certain carbon limits for power plants and vehicles and emissions requirements. Likewise, the Energy Department has also removed some efficiency standards for different products, for example, battery chargers or those sorts of consumer electronic products. So what you're seeing there is not necessarily a rollback completely on the federal enforcement level, but a realignment where prior planning that had gone into developing different regulations and regimes that were expected to come into force have either been put on hold or are now undergoing revision. So you see this at the federal level where there is essentially a pullback in certain areas. And what that leads to ultimately is a regulatory void that is then filled by the states and their regulations, which I'll get to in a moment, but wanted to stay on the federal side first and how that trend is developing, as I just mentioned. There are some areas where agencies have kind of bucked that trend and instead focused on new enforcement areas or instead focusing their enforcement on specific targeted areas within their jurisdiction. So, for example, the Consumer Product Safety Commission has been quite active and has had one of the most active years thus far on recalls. There have been many more recalls than we've seen in the last several years. They're likely trying to go to kind of break the record, so to speak, of the number of recalls in a single year. So that the chairman of the CPSC has essentially stated that was a goal, that more recalls is better. And so what you're seeing is an increased focus on the number of recalls. And the way CPSC is doing that is in some ways going after the low-hanging fruit. So they're looking at products that don't meet mandatory regulations or bans. There's a special focus there on products that are imported, in particular from China. There's been increased focus on enforcement there. CPSC has been going after products that don't meet these requirements, seeking recalls, and if companies don't agree to recalls, they've been announcing what are called unilateral press releases, which essentially is where the agency just alerts the public to a potential hazard and then moves on to the next thing. So you've seen this increase, although in other areas of the federal government, there has been a decrease in activity. So that is kind of one area where the federal government has at least maintained a cadence of enforcement. Likewise, the Federal Communications Commission has also focused on Chinese companies and whether their products are complying with Part 15 requirements for unintentional radiators and intentional radiators, so RF emissions requirements, and have also indicated an increased focus on national security and designating companies as being included on the covered list, which would essentially makes the company unacceptable from a national security risk perspective, and therefore not prohibiting those companies from selling products in the United States that connect to wireless networks, for example. Likewise, at the Federal Trade Commission, where I also, as Orla mentioned, had worked previously, that agency does not have a privacy regime that it can point to a specific statute, but it does have enforcement tools in privacy. And some of those enforcement tools, for example, focus on children. So COPPA, as many know, is a statute and a related regulatory regime that relates to children's privacy online. And the FTC's focus has clearly been directed to increased attention to children and their privacy online. So not only using COPPA, but also the other Section 5 tools that the FTC has to focus on that. The FTC has also indicated an increased interest in AI and online chatbots. So that agency is, despite a general rollback of some regulation in the federal government, has increased the focus on these areas and intends to continue enforcing and continue enforcing in a specific area to address specific risks. So where the federal government pulls back, that leads to this regulatory void that I was discussing, and the states have not held back in filling that void. In 2025, we saw over 1,000 AI-related bills introduced by the states, and now 4 states have AI laws in the books. That is going to be a trend that we'll see continue into 2026, with the federal government not really taking any action on AI or those sorts, or privacy in those related areas. States will need to continue expanding regulation there to, one, make sure that they're kind of protecting their constituencies, but also aligning with other states and creating requirements that are cohesive. That is much easier said than done. States often do not coordinate, although there are non-governmental organizations and that kind of work together to allow the states to communicate about different statutory regimes and trying to align those. It's not always perfect, and many of these laws are crafted by the legislature without consideration of exactly how this is going to impact compliance in another state. So this increased fragmentation is being driven by the regulatory pullback or lack of legislation in at the federal level, and a desire or need by the states to regulate in areas where there's increased technological development and demand by their constituencies for regulation. And so this fragmentation and different state regimes will continue to develop as I note here in the slide. Now we have 20 states with comprehensive privacy laws. That we expect that trend to continue, with new states looking to introduce new privacy laws and rules. Likewise, 4 states now have comprehensive data broker laws. Shifting from privacy to kind of more product-related, tangible product-related type requirements. 7 states now have comprehensive packaging EPR laws that are either now in place or will be coming online. And many of those initial requirements begin in 2026 for producers to register or take other action to begin complying with those laws. Similarly, there are now 8 states that have right to repair regimes, and those right to repair regimes are again, a new area where states are regulating. So historically, right to repair was something that the Federal Trade Commission, through the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act, regulated to some extent. But given the lack of activity at the federal level on this and the demand by consumers to have right to repair as something that is there to help them navigate their the products that they're buying, we're going to see increased regulation in that area. And so now these 8 states have these right to repair regimes that are either in place or coming online. And so again, at the US level right now, it's a fragmented focus, and the states are not holding back in regulation. What I would say kind of as areas where companies can and should focus as they think about this is to think about compliance as not something that maybe it previously used to be at just the federal level, and you could kind of expect state regulations to match the federal regulations without going too far above them. Now you have to really look at every single state and think about compliance obligations there as you go into the U.S. as a market generally. So what I would suggest, there is an area of continued focus is aligning compliance across these different fragmented areas, and where there is a disconnect between different requirements in different states to address that focus. So with that, I will now turn it over to Jess.
Thank you so much, Philip. So we are going to zoom in onto a specific sector of pharma, device regulations, so the life science industry. And 2025 has really been a very busy year. The regulatory landscape has never been more dynamic, and from the looks of it, 2026 is going to be even more eventful. So there have been a lot of changes. We are not going to look at everything today, so there are other important changes and initiatives that are not on my slides, but we are going to focus on a few things. First, we're going to look at a few key regulatory changes that actually came into application this year, so you know what to look out for in the immediate term. And then I'll flag 2 life sciences specific upcoming changes, so you know what to keep an eye on for the mid to long term. So before we jump into really the specifics of individual regulatory changes that are set out on the slide, something that I think is worth noting is that these changes and related initiatives are really being driven by several common things. The first is keeping up with our time. We need to make sure that outdated legislation is up to date and try to keep it up with technological, social, and commercial realities. A second common theme is simplification, and you heard my colleagues mention this before on the EU front. And in the life science industry, which has a particularly complex regulatory framework, there's just been a general call for simplification. This is combined with a third theme of fostering innovation within the EU. We definitely need to find a way to retain our innovation and make the EU attractive. And the fourth theme in the life science industry and these different initiatives is really global supply chain concerns. In 2025, supply chain security is still a top policy and really an industry priority. So a lot of the authorities are really looking to tackle it and improve the current situation. So turning to the latest and the greatest, what happened this year? The first change within this table is the clinical trials regulation. So this is the first one here, but also one of my favorites, I think. 2025 was the entry into full application of the clinical trials regulation, which is new legislation that really revamps the process for conducting clinical trials in the EU. And we're hitting multiple themes with this one. We're updating really old legislation from 2001, we're simplifying the process by permitting the submission of a single application for multiple EU member states. And we're introducing a coordinated assessment of part of the application. And at the same time, by simplifying the process, we're trying to foster innovation in the EU. So all around really interesting. A second key change in the pharma world has been the entry into application of the Health Technology Assessment Regulation. This also aims to make manufacturers' life somewhat easier by introducing, again, a joint clinical assessment across EU member states for new medicinal products, rather than having to go to each EU member state. We're trying to refocus parts of these assessments. And at the moment, this has a limited scope, but it'll progressively expand to all medicinal products by 2030. A third big change in the pharma industry is the variations regulation and guidance. So more simplification should also be seen in this area. So in terms of variations that are made to an existing marketing authorization, and starting early next year, so 2026, these new guidelines are going to enter into application, and they really aim to facilitate quicker and more efficient processing of variations. So there have been several changes that have been introduced for that, new classifications, changes in some of the classifications, opportunity for seeking advice, and grouping of certain types of variation applications. So this was more on the pharma side, but looking to the device world, we really had 3 decisive changes, I think, this year. The most important one, to a certain extent, I'd say, is the extension of the transitional periods for in vitro diagnostic medical devices. So essentially, under certain conditions, in vitro diagnostic medical devices, which were placed on the market under the prior regime, can continue to be placed on the market for a few more years, depending on the risk classification. Now, a similar initiative was already taken in the medical device world, and this is really to help industry and also notified bodies adapt to the new regulatory frameworks. So a very welcome initiative. A second big change has been new information obligations. Now, this is for medical device and in vitro diagnostic medical device manufacturers. Since January of this year, they need to immediately inform economic operators they supply and national competent authorities where they're established of any anticipated interruption or termination of supply that could lead to serious harm to patients or public health. So this is really focused on supply chain security here. A third big change, in the medical device industry has been Unimed. This is our EU medical device platform. There's been a lot of back and forth on how it's going to be used, whether it's going to be mandatory or not. Essentially here, what you need to remember is that amongst 4 of the 6 modules that operate through Unimed, 4 are going to become mandatory from 28th of May, 2026. So these are all changes that really need to be taken into account today. And it just provides, again, an overview. But if we look to the future, there's, of course, more to come, just to make things a little more exciting. And so we're looking at 2 potential gifts for around now or Christmas. The first is, hopefully, an agreed package for the review of the pharmaceutical legislation. And the second is a new proposal for revisions to medical device regulation and in vitro diagnostic medical device regulation. So on the pharma review side, the discussions have been ongoing since April of 2023. There have been really heated debates. We know there are going to be changes, and we've listed a few key takeaways on the slide, but we're not exactly sure what they're going to look like in practice. So that's still subject of big discussions. And a really key area of change is what is going to happen to data and market exclusivity. So these are regulatory protections afforded to certain types of marketing authorizations. And we currently have a really predictable system, but discussions have been centered around potentially reducing the baseline period, so reducing the time of protection, and adopting a much more incentivized-based approach. So this has been a big concern for industry. And what we do know is that they're actually meeting today. And so we hope they'll reach an agreement on certain technical aspects. And so definitely keep your eyes peeled in the next couple of days or hours. We definitely will be. So moving to the MedTech or device front, there have been just clear issues with the implementation of the medical device regulation and the in vitro diagnostic regulation. These have already led to several amendments, in particular to really extend the transitional provisions. We're trying to give more time for industry and notified bodies to adapt, but it just hasn't been enough. Manufacturers are still facing conflicting interpretations of the rules and the requirements. There have just been extreme bottlenecks with notified bodies and immense delay in terms of performing conformity assessment and trying to get a product on the market. And the costs have just gone through the roof. So the goal here is to tackle a number of known issues that'll hopefully speed up the process and also simplify the conformity assessment, including to make sure that we retain innovation in the EU. So this is just a brief overview, but with all these changes and more to come for next year, we're definitely at a turning point. And I think stakeholders in the life science industry here, but not only, really have so many regulatory initiatives to track. It can be truly overwhelming. I think it's great to prepare, to keep an eye out and see what's coming. But I think something to remember, and Emma touched upon this earlier, is also to focus on what we have at the moment, what we need to comply with, and what we know is coming. So with that, I will turn back to Orla.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much. There's so much happening, and it's really hard to condense it down into 50 minutes. So really appreciate that. And thank you all for your attention so far as well. As promised, we now have the floor open for the Q&A session. So if you have any questions at all that you would like us to answer, please do let us know using the Ask a Question widget to the left side of your screen. And we have a few incoming questions already, so we'll answer them now. You mentioned the CSRD thresholds for EU companies. Can you talk about what the new CSRD thresholds are for non-EU parent companies? If someone could take that.
Sure, I think this one for me. Thanks, Orla. So right now, we just have the official press releases, which don't actually give a lot of detail on what the non-EU thresholds will be under CSRD. Based on kind of leaked drafts that have been circulated, what we've seen is that it looks like it's going to be non-EU groups that generate in the EU at the group consolidated level over 450 million euros of turnover, and that have at least one EU subsidiary or branch that generates over 200 million euros of turnover. So a kind of difference with the non-EU thresholds from what we've seen for the EU thresholds is that there is no employee test. So you don't have to have the minimum of 1,000 employees, which could make a big difference for a lot of companies. As I say, this is based on leaked drafts, so definitely one to double check once we get the final version of the text out.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.
Next question. The CPSC has remained active in the product safety space. For non-US companies that have less familiarity with CPSC, what areas of focus are you seeing at the agency?
Thanks, Orla. I think that one is for me. So, as I was mentioning, right now, CPSC is strongly focused on kind of getting their numbers up with recalls. We can debate about whether that particular metric is the right metric for product safety, but that's largely one of the ones they're using now. So they're looking for low-hanging fruit often, and that means products that don't comply with mandatory standards, bans, et cetera. So I think, initially what I would say is CPSC actually has kind of a handy tool, particularly for simple questions, for product compliance questions. It's called the regulatory robot. You can, go to the CPSC's website and it'll at least get you pointed in the right direction. For more complex questions, obviously, you might want to consult with kind of your counsel on that. But making sure that your products are compliant with mandatory requirements is kind of the first and easiest piece of compliance in the US right now, because if they're not, CPSC, if they learn about it, they will require you to take immediate corrective action. And if you don't take corrective action, they'll just go out and announce that your products are non-compliant without you likely. So, that would be one piece. And then the other piece is to always keep in mind that with CPSC, there's an obligation to report hazards and incidents. And so, evaluating that obligation and making sure that that if you do get incidents and reports involving your products in the U.S. or internationally, and if that product is sold in the U.S., to evaluate your reporting obligation and then report to the agency, because what you don't want to be in a situation where the CPSC comes to you and says, we found this out about your product, and is demanding a recall. So being able to stay ahead of that and knowing what's happening is certainly the best way to tackle it.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Philip. Moving on to the next question. You mentioned that the use of 4 EUDA Med modules will become mandatory in 2026. Which modules are concerned? And I hope I pronounced that correctly.
That one's for me. I pronounce it UDAMED. I don't know if that's correct, but that's what I'm going with. So yeah, we have 6 modules that are supposed to be implemented through UDAMED. The 4 that will become mandatory in May are registration of economic operators. So manufacturers, importers, authorized reps, you need to register through UDAMED, which also means you no longer need to register through EU member states systems, which is good. The second module is for UDI and device registration. The third is more for notified bodies and information related to certificates. And the third is market surveillance. The 2 that are still pending is vigilance and post-market surveillance, and the module on clinical investigations and performance studies. These aren't expected to be ready until late 2025, 2026, mid 2027. And once they are ready and they've been subject of an audit, then we need the notice that we just got for the other 4 modules a couple weeks ago that says, okay, these are ready to go. They can enter into application later on, I think it's 12 months.
Great. Thanks very much. Moving on to the next question. Is there any guidance on how to apply GPSR to standalone software?
Thank you, Orla. Yeah, great question. Not really at the moment. So we have this position whereby the European Commission has very much called out standalone software, but as yet we just haven't seen anything which helps us understand how would we take these constructs which very much think about kind of physical products and how would we apply them to software. So for example, where would we label the responsible person and the manufacturer? What would we do in relation to like risk assessments and technical files, like what should they be containing? So at the moment, it's a complete unknown.
Great, thank you, Claire. The next question is, what changes might be under consideration as part of the review of the MDR/IVDR?
Darla. Again, that would be for me. So I think the industry has focused on a few key areas. We definitely want to reduce the administrative burden. It's just such a heavy lift to put together the tech file, the internal SOPs, the policies. Just going through prepping for the conformity assessment process is a really massive lift. So we want to reduce some of the admin burden there. We also want to improve predictability because there have been variances in terms of how the rules are applied, particularly and the requirements, particularly in terms of clinical investigations and the level of data that's going to be required. And we want a cost-efficient approach for certification, but also commensurating the requirements with the device classification. So it's not clear what will be in the proposal. It's a proposal for a review of existing legislation, so it's not a full revamp. But subjects that have been on the table have been potentially removing recertification after 5 years, just because essentially we've had a bottleneck for so long. And if the devices that have been certified 4 years ago need to be certified next year, and we have transitional provisions that are, or the periods that are going to expire, it might create a new bottleneck between next year and 2029. So that's something that's been pushed forward. The other option that's been discussed in the European Commission actually has a plan for this, is introducing a dedicated accelerated pathway for breakthrough innovations. So this was discussed last month at the conference. they have a plan, they have an idea, and they plan on opening a sandbox, this should be a potential Christmas present. So we're keeping our eyes peeled for that one too. And then a couple more items that may come up is timeframes for review. That might be wishful thinking, but it would be fabulous, just making sure that notified bodies actually have to provide the review view conformity assessment within certain periods. And another one that's been on high demand by industry is just enhancing dialogue between notified bodies and the industry. Currently, they're kind of hitting a wall where notified bodies say, oh, well, we can't advise, but then there's uncertainty and then there's delay in the process, and it's just not always very constructive. So I hope those items will be in a proposal.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jessica. And unfortunately, I'm very conscious of the time. That's all we have time for with the Q&A session. But again, there's still time to submit more questions, and we'll follow up with you directly after the webinar. But that does conclude our final webinar of the year. And thank you so much to our experts here from Cooley for your incredible insights and for collaborating with us today. And to all of you who tuned in with us too, we really hope you found it helpful and look forward to seeing you in our future webinars. You can find these in our resources section on the Compliance and Risks website to stay updated and to access more content, including white papers, blogs, guides, and of course, both live and on-demand webinars. Our first webinar of 2026, AI Rules Are Changing, Key Regulatory Updates for 2025 and 2026, is scheduled for January 14th. So we do hope to see you there. Thanks again to Cooley, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day.